to the Thoughtful Software Podcast with your hosts, Andrew Wolf and Fahad Shokat. Thoughtful Software is a set of values, principles, and techniques to fuel digital innovation. We want to help usher in a new approach to the way software is imagined, designed, and built. In this episode, we are speaking with Darren Gallop, CEO and co-founder of Securicy, a venture-backed company that helps startups simplify information security and privacy compliance. SaaS startups are becoming a major target for hackers because they are such easy marks. For founders, cybersecurity is often an afterthought, leaving them vulnerable to legal, financial, and reputational risk that can destroy their startup. Andrew, Fahad, and Darren cover the most common mistakes SaaS founders make when it comes to security, best practices they can follow, and share actionable insights into what they can do to prepare themselves for the year. Here's Andrew, Fahad, and Darren.
Okay, so let's discuss everyone's favorite topic, compliance. It's on everybody's mind all the time, not actually, but actually it's not often thought about initially until you really have, unless you really have to. But nonetheless, compliance is quite important to address sooner than later. And the challenge lies in navigating all these various standards, developing a process, and managing control. So this is where companies such as Securicy come to save the day and to help companies take control of security and simplify the process of compliance. So it's great to have you on, Darren. Maybe we can start off and you can tell us a little bit about Securicy.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be on the show as well. So yeah, Securicy is a platform that we've developed to help SaaS companies. A lot of our customers are B2B SaaS companies. So they're selling into enterprise or regulated industries or selling to the government, and they're being asked a whole lot of questions. They may be being asked to demonstrate their compliance to particular security standards or privacy legislation. And basically, we've built a platform and we have a service division that really helps companies figure out what's applicable to them in the security and privacy standards and help them build that out in a very efficient manner, and then giving them the tools to be able to demonstrate some transparency to their customers so their customers can quickly see that they're a trustworthy company that's following the right practices and meeting the compliance requirements. So really reducing that friction in the sales process that happens when you're sort of going back and forth on security questionnaires, really having it together and being in a good security posture when you start engaging in those conversations with them.
Interesting. So one of the bigger things with compliance that I run into, I was a CTO before I was a CEO, but even now, it's always top of mind with our clients. And, it's really an ever-evolving ecosystem. CCPA last month got extended with additional oversight from a new agency in California. GDPR changes almost every month, or how they enforce it seems to change every month. New York has new privacy laws coming online. Ohio, Florida, Montana, Washington. These new states are having new compliance frameworks. And that's not to mention the ones that already exist. HIPAA, there's like 47 different healthcare regulations, finance regulations, and compliance. How do you, with all of these, controls and everything, obviously they're kind of segmented. How do you advise your customers and how to not only be compliant, but stay up to date with this just ever evolving, very much increasing velocity realm of compliance?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is a tough thing, and it's a very complex thing to look at it. One of the things that I would say, one of my cheat notes for the day, I guess, is that a lot of these privacy regulations overlap to some degree. So generally speaking, I can give you an example. If you were to deploy GDPR, say you're going to put a security program in place to meet the security requirements of GDPR, for example, that would also cover the majority of the requirements for Canada's Privacy Act. And it would also cover some of the requirements for CCPA. So as you're implementing whether it be a privacy piece of privacy legislation in your business or implementing a security control set like SOC 2 trust principles or ISO 27001, you're inherently adopting other best practices that are bringing you into a certain compliance position with all of these other regulations and standards. So, I'm not saying they're all the same. I'm just saying that there's a substantial amount of overlap. So generally, the process that we take when we look at a customer, or that we suggest people that are sort of conquering this problem look at, is basically establish, first of all, what are the compliance requirements they have. And then there's like ourselves, there's other companies and other sources out there where you can see matrices where you're comparing the compliance overlaps. And there's that's sort of on a high level. It's obviously not that easy, or companies like mine wouldn't exist. So there certainly is a need to manage controls and stay up to speed with how things evolve. So security standards have updates that are issued. Depending on the standard, it could be as much as every year, every couple of years. So that's something that every time these standards that you are needing to be compliant, or that you're using to benchmark your security program, you need to be aware of those. And the privacy laws, they're a little more challenging because a law is generated, and then we see what happens when people go to court, and when there's actually case law that starts to be established, and you start seeing how courts position various decisions on things. The first thing I usually say when people are freaking out about something like GDPR compliance is it's not generally, it's very uncommon that you're going to be fined because you're not 100% compliant in every single way to the interpretation of the law. Where you're seeing most of the issues is where companies are far from being compliant or not respecting the law. So, I think it's almost impossible to be perfect. So to be perfectly compliant across a plethora of different privacy laws is a really challenging thing. But generally speaking, if your compliance score is in a reasonable position, that you're generally in a good place. So yeah, so that's generally how we look at it.
Is that something that's evolved over time, where before it was almost like, you check the boxes, but now it's more on a risk score? So you're kind of assessed more on, like, are you following best practices and like trying your best? You're not completely on the other side, right?
Yeah, it depends on who is doing the assessing, right? So if you're talking about privacy law, and you're talking about being in court and potentially being, against potential non-compliance lawsuit with the courts, that's one situation. And generally, I haven't looked at all the GDPR cases. I'm not a lawyer myself, just to disclose that, but the ones that we've seen is they have this up to a certain amount for the fine. Generally speaking, the people that are getting max fines or getting treated that way are really approaching it with absolute ignorance or disrespect. If you're obviously putting in a really strong effort for your budget and the size of your company, and you're for the most part compliant, then you have a lot less risk in that sense. But when you start talking about sort of where you're talking to your customers, and your customers are coming to you and asking you about your compliance or your risk, that is really unique to each industry and each company that's scrutinizing your security posture. I spend a lot of time, and my team spends a lot of time, helping our customers meet the requirements of a variety of large corporations around the world. And we see a lot of differences from one organization to another, but also the nature of the work you're going to do. So how much data are you going to have access? How much exposure does your startup, for example, is it, if there were a breach, or there was a loss of availability, or the integrity of your work was bad, like, what is the impact to them? And that'll also depict on, that'll help sort of them decide what their risk tolerance is with your organization. So it is a bit of a unique thing. The one thing I can say, I started doing this from my last company in about 2013, 2014. We started getting security questionnaires, and I was handling those security questionnaires and managing the security of that business. The level of sophistication and the risk focus today compared to what it was 4, 5, 6 years ago is substantially more, is more sophisticated, I would say. So I would say a lot of the exercises that I saw 5 years ago that customers would put us through seem to be led by general counsel and seem to be sort of them making sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's, and they have a file in there that shows that they've done their compliance of verifying vendors with a documented practice and procedure. What I'm seeing now, and I've sort of just jumped back in the trenches with a couple of big customers that we're working with, and they're getting a lot of questionnaires. And what I'm seeing now is the risk scoring is definitely more priority now. So I think companies are taking it more seriously from an actual risk reduction process versus a general counsel led administrative compliance exercise. So they will ask compliance questions. They're obviously still concerned about maintaining their compliance, but I'm seeing them wanting to dive in with the CTO, talk a bit more about the application security, really push on some of the questions to make sure that best practices are really in place there, and that this is real, and actually give it a risk score. And then that risk score goes back to senior management and goes, okay, here's the risk profile of the company, and then the decision to proceed, not proceed, or to require that startup to do more, or to up their game in order to proceed, is made. So that would be the thing that's really changed. And again, even since COVID has come in to the situation, I think COVID really forced a lot of enterprise organizations to go back and review big components of their own internal security programs,
Right.
things like work from home, and not being in the office, and migrating to cloud in ways that they hadn't potentially before, have all influenced sort of looking at the security program, looking at disaster recovery. So yeah, it's a lot more real now than it ever has been.
So when we talk about the components of compliance, it sounds a lot like software architecture. So I'm going to call it your compliance architecture. Let's say I'm a company that's just getting relevant enough to need some of this compliance architecture. It sounds like you do a lot of scoring. Would the appropriate place to start with a compliance architecture is just kind of take a risk score of all of your, I guess, compliance needs, and then start tackling the components that remove the most risk and therefore protect you? Or where would you start, if not that, to help start getting compliant? Because there's a lot here, right? It's like you said, it's a massive field. So where would you tell people to start with their compliance architecture?
Yeah, so it's an interesting the conversation and the parallels and differences between compliance and secure. Becoming compliant doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. It generally means that if you're complying with a quality standard and you're doing it in a meaningful way, it should inherently improve your security. The key thing of security's always been a subject that is led by risk, right? And so what you're saying there in terms of looking at your company, your situation, and conducting a risk analysis, a risk assessment of your company, and focusing your energy where the greatest risk is existent, that is the best way to approach from a security perspective. We have seen control sets or standards start to adopt the concept of risk very heavily. So, we're seeing the compliance, the standards like the SOC 2 trust principles as a good example that leverages risk scoring in its content. We're starting to see that evolution of compliance becoming a more secure driven from those best practices. I don't look at it simply from an architecture thing when you look at a startup, because every startup is different. And sometimes you'll see a situation where, hey, they're in AWS, they're using all the right tools, their software is they have pen tests, they have all this good stuff. They're leveraging something like OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, open source information about best practices in software development. They're using all these good things, but then you find out, oh, but all the software developers have full access to production, and they're so sometimes we find that the vulnerabilities, and both in a security perspective and a compliance perspective, can actually reside in humans and can be things that are not exclusive to, say, your architecture of your server environment or your how you've built your application or how your code is being tested or deployed. They're all factors, and certainly they're big ones. One thing I would say, and this is a thing I say to startups. So I meet with and mentor a couple of very early stage startups. And I always recommend as a starting point for early stage startups that are not already selling in that environment where they're being asked for compliance and for security and risk profiles is to think about their architecture really, really early. So not my next, like, here's my next tip on security is the longer you wait, the harder it is, the more expensive it is, and the longer it will take to build a security program. So if you start off initially, even simple things like if you can start with your software team having some lunch and learns about OWASP and just the fact of them learning and becoming aware and you articulating in your business that security is important. You're not just like pushing them to deploy the code, get the feature out fast, make it look pretty. If that's all you're asking for and you're not stipulating security is important, then what's going to happen, and I see this all the time, a company goes on, writes tons of code over 3 or 4 years. They have this huge code base. There has been no consideration of security. The developers don't even know what OWASP even is. And all of a sudden now they have this big fish. They got the big POC, the big contract on the door. And now they need to get a pen test.
Yeah.
And okay, well, we'll do the pen test. The pen test finds that, okay, well, there's a lot of things here that aren't done right. And well, the more code you have, the more repeats of those things not being done right. So you can end up with a scenario of having a lot of technical security debt in the way your applications have been designed and developed. So if you just start thinking about that from day one, it's amazing the difference that will make in how your team builds their software over time.
Interesting. So let's go in the opposite direction. So we work with startups. We also work with some of the largest organizations in the world. And a lot of these people have compliance frameworks already. They're trying to get in and work. And in the past, the way it was always done when I was a developer was I get a survey from some random auditor and they'd ask me a bunch of questions and I'd either say, well, I don't know, or this is the answer. And it was the least collaborative process I think I've ever been a part of. How would you advise CIOs, CTOs of large organizations that how do they partner with compliance and make it less of a, oh man, it sucks, I have to be compliant, and more of a, okay, this is a natural order of doing business, and make it, kind of like product. We've if you look at agile teams, we have marketing teams now, sales, and we try to create these cross-functional teams. But compliance is never part of those teams. It's always off on the side, the stiff lawyers, the FOSS team, the people like that. How do we incorporate compliance? What advice would you give the CIOs and CTOs to incorporate them into these cross-functional teams to make compliance less of a adversary and more of a team member?
Yeah, I am a big fan of it being incorporated into general processes and procedures and activity. I believe in the value of a security culture. And that's where, instead of whining about it or being frustrated or seeing it as a us versus them kind of thing, it's just the reality of the world we live in. Cybercrime generates more revenue than all illicit drug and weapons combined in terms of black market revenue. So it's real. And there's all kinds of people out there and everybody's a target to some degree. And it's just the reality. It's a thing you need to do nowadays. I think getting over it as thinking of it as a frustration and thinking about it in a creative way and just building it into your business in a way that's meaningful, showing that it's valued by senior management, and get ahead of it. And that getting ahead of it is the biggest thing. Like when somebody asks us, for example, if we're talking to a prospect about security, we just send them our security report. We don't wait reactively for them to send us a survey. I find that if you really have a good security program and you have a reporting process or a process that allows your customer to gain transparency and insight on how you're actually securing their data, a lot of times you won't be required to even fill out the security questionnaire if you've done that piece right. So I'm a huge fan of that. And then if you do have that, then the security questionnaire becomes a thing where you're like, yes, 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 no. And a lot of your answers are, see attached document, company name, security report, December 2020 or whatever. And so, I'm a really big fan of that process of just baking it into everything you do. So if you're familiar with GDPR, and if you've dealt with GDPR, there's a concept of security by design, right? And that's where you don't just think it's not a separate department. It's like, we're talking about what we're building. Okay, cool. We're building this thing. We're gonna capture this data. We're gonna have this much data. We're gonna have this much PII. We're gonna have this health data. Okay, what are the risks? What are the things we need to think about here? And generally, like, if it's HIPAA and GDPR and SOC, like, I still design, when I work with a company, I make sure, hey, there's one security program in this business. You can articulate that and benchmark it against various different standards or regulations when customers ask. But generally, we have a security posture. We have looked at our company. We've done a risk assessment on our company. We've made decisions that are approved at the senior level of what we're going to do, what we're not going to do, what compensating controls are. And when you make those decisions and you have good logical answers and you've established a strong security posture that you can stand behind, then you don't have to answer yes. I get people that call me all the time, like, oh my God, I need a SOC 2 audit and it's going to cost $30,000. I was like, well, who told you need to get that SOC 2 audit? I'm not saying you don't, but where did you get this information? It's like, well, it's the first question on the security questionnaire. My first question is, well, have you offered them another alternative? Did you send them a security report that shows you benchmarking your security controls against another modern and established control set? Well, no. Well, if you offer them something, if you've created something that works in your business, and again, this is why it's so good to do it early, because it's a lot easier when there's a few people to just think about this. So it's a constant thing that as you're growing, you're always evolving that security versus like building a company for 5 or 6 or 10 years. And then like, you get this big crack at the biggest deal you've ever had. And it's like hair on fire, panic scene. Yeah, I don't recommend the latter. So, getting ahead of it early and thinking about security in every piece of it will build a culture of security where your team will know what they need to know. And people will just inherently consider security intelligently on their own. Like, hey, somebody asked me to put all this data in HubSpot. Does that make sense? Because this is PII. So when people start doing that in your organization, that means you've succeeded. Now have a team that is conscious of the importance of security and compliance in your business.
So I have one last question. I know Fahad has a bunch. So one of the things that I'm a big fan of, I actually spend some time down in the state house talking to legislators and stuff in Ohio because I'm so interested in the tech state. I live here, so I spend time helping people understand technology. One, because I'm a business here, but two, I care about my fellow citizens and I want that to do good. But the thing I find really interesting is that companies never are really forward-looking when it comes to compliance. It's to your point of being security first, this becomes an afterthought. They only enforce CCPA at their company when they have to. What would you say how would a company try to be forward-looking with regards to compliance? For example, one of the things that's coming up a lot is data biases, right? And I fully expect either California, potentially even the EU, probably sometime by 2021 or early 2022, will have some sort of data bias law, an algorithm bias law on the books, and people will be forced to be compliant with it. What form that takes, no one knows, but I think there's some best practices already being formed. Well, should companies invest in compliance before it happens? Is that a waste of money? Or should they just wait until it's enforced and then instead of being proactive, be reactive to it?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of reactive because, again, as I said earlier, it often means you have to go back and redo things you've already done, which is more expensive. Now, I get it. It's startup world. Like sometimes you're like, we got 6 months of money and we got to figure out a way to build a thing that works, or we're not going to have a business. And therefore, on our risk assessment, running out of money is our biggest risk, right? So, I get you're against that. You're sort of up against that challenge. But I do believe that like compliance doesn't have to be. There's this perception that like a security program or compliance is an expensive thing, when in fact, like I'll give you an example. You have a team. Everybody has a MacBook, let's say, just for simplicity, because that's what I have in front of me right now. Like there's a whole bunch of tools built right into the operating system. You just got to have a policy or checklist or think about it. Say turn these things on, right? It's getting better over time in terms of default configurations becoming more more secure configurations versus even what it was a couple of years ago. I believe now in the latest OS and newly shipped machines, they come default with File Vault AES 256 encryption, for example. That never was the case historically. So, a real simple thing you can do: go into system preferences, turn on File Vault. Wow, now all your data on your laptop is encrypted. So if you leave it at a bar or somebody steals it, they're not going to access the company data that's on it. Like, that's just one example. There's all kinds of things like two-factor authentication, enforcing two-factor authentication in your Google environment or your Microsoft environment. Like, there's just most of the tools that startups use today they have security programs and security features already in the tools, right? So, like, just being conscious and being aware and prioritizing security and thinking about security compliance, even if you pick a more basic standard as a starting point, like a CIS, Center for Internet Security Group 1 or something like that. Like, you just, you don't have to go spend $50,000. You can actually just have good policy and good procedure and good configuration around the stuff you're already using in your business. And that alone is a substantial improvement from just default turn everything on type of mentality that I think a lot of startups have traditionally sort of followed.
I think it's interesting. I think one way to look at this, because I'm the sales guy, uh, for many years, is that looking at compliance from what drives business, as opposed to like, hey, we should be thinking about this and training people, is almost treated like a feature that I think, for, just talking to clients rather than waiting for that questionnaire, it's also part of, your feature set that, we're selling this, but it's also fully compliant. I think a lot of companies do that. But I think if in a cultural standpoint that, if that's one of the leading things that you're discussing and trying to sell, it just kind of trickles down that this is important, just as any feature in an application is important. This ability for us to be compliant, just as HIPAA, you have to be compliant, and that's part of the sales pitch. So other companies can also start thinking about that. So it becomes almost like a unique selling tool. And I think that when things like that drive business, I think people, even executives across the board, will get behind it.
That's totally true. My last company, in 2013, 2014, when we started getting security questionnaires, we had made the decision at, I believe, 12 employees at the time to get a SOC 2 Type 1 certification and to become compliant with ISO 27001. Now, seemed like kind of a crazy thing, but what it enabled us to do from a sales and marketing perspective is when a customer or a prospect was talking to us, as well as some of our other up and coming competitors, we would drive into that. How important is availability and the correctness of data, confidentiality? Like, how burnt would you be if the data that you're putting in the system got exposed into the web? Like, the bands, like, we were in the event space, so we're working with customers like Coachella and Bonnaroo and whatnot. So, it's like, how much of a problem would this be if the lineup for Coachella got leaked, well in advance of the time that you want it to be exposed out there? Well, this would cause all kinds of problems, contractual, etc. So, we would say, well, look, we are certified by this organization. We follow this international standard. Here's all the things we do to secure your data. We recommend that you ask the other competitors that you're talking to what they're doing to secure your data. So that was part of our sales pitch, and it worked, because people go, damn, I don't want to lose we can't afford to lose. Yeah, this would be embarrassing. This would cause all kinds of problems. Somebody lose their job, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is a competitive advantage. I think, though, now in 2020 and moving into 2021, I think it's kind of just going to become a license. Like, it's just an expectation um, in a lot of industries. And, we saw it first sort of happening in fintech and obviously healthcare, where there's regulatory requirements, like HIPAA. But with privacy law really accelerating this drive on security. With privacy law, now you're talking about personally identifiable information. Well, that's who doesn't collect some level of PII. So you're talking about name, phone number, address, habits, what they're viewing on the web, whatever that is. So that's really sort of opened this up to take the practices that anyone who was selling into fintech's been dealing with for quite some time and move it into almost every industry really quickly.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that's on a direction, like in we know that privacy is demanding this change, and it's going to be like table stakes. You have to have all these things in place, or at least have some sort of plan in place. And so, as a startup, for sure, think about how you're going to approach this, or have an answer ready, as opposed to kind of being reactive around it. From your experience, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen companies, not just startups, but enterprise make when it comes to compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think waiting until you need it is a really big mistake. And this is why. And there's some naivety out there. I think there's a lot of startups that wait until they get that questionnaire and they absolutely have to bite the bullet, like thinking they can just like sign up for a thing or pay someone and then abracadabra, you're now secure and you're able to pass the security audit that your dream customer is putting in front of you. It's not it's a really bad look when you have a sales process going, you've got really good rapport, back and forth is happening at a really good cadence. Now you get the security questionnaire and it's like, uh-oh. And now you're like everyone's running around trying to figure out, they're looking at the security questionnaire. It might take them a week to two to figure out how they're going to get help and what that's going to look like. Then it takes a week to get through it all and realize, oh wow, we're not doing most of this stuff. And you have like naivety of people coming and goes, oh, we don't need to worry about that because of this. And it's like, well, no, actually you do because of all these things. And now you're now stalling this process. And so when you develop a cadence in a sales cycle with an enterprise organization and they ask questions about your trustability and your security, and you're not able to answer those in a reasonable time frame, it's pretty clear to most auditors that you're not able to answer them because you don't have you're not there yet. And then that starts to create more concern and starts to just increase your risk profile because it's clear to them that you're scrambling in the background trying to figure this all out. So waiting to you absolutely need it. Yeah, that's a really risky situation that could cost you a big deal. I actually lost $150,000 deal in my last company that would have been reoccurring of that rate over, who knows, maybe the entire rest of the time that I owned the company. And we lost it because of that. We were doing everything we could, like a lot of smart people, a lot of horsepower being put at solving the problem. But because we hadn't taken that situation or the security in general seriously before it was at our doorstep, then it just wasn't possible for us to fix all of the things. They wanted a pen test that showed that our app was being managed in a secure way. We got a pen test done and we showed some not so great things. And because at that time, I think we had like 6 or 7 years of code base. There was quite a bit of code. There was a lot of features, a lot of different pieces to the application. There was a lot of work to do to clean up that to get to the point where we could have a retest and have a favorable result. So, waiting to the last minute is definitely a big mistake. I hear startups all the time. I talked to a guy not that long ago. He was like, oh, we're waiting until we get 2 million ARR before we deploy security. It's like what logic are you utilizing to come up with that decision? It's clear that you're lacking an understanding of what is actually at risk for your business and for your sales in doing this, right? So the other ones that there's a bunch of things that I see people say in calls. Sometimes there are calls that I have when I'm trying to establish what they're doing and figuring out how they're thinking about this. And they say these really naive things that I always say, like, okay, stop, never say that again. Okay. When you say that, it just means that you don't know what you're talking about. So, like, you're paying me, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you that you can't say that to an auditor. And some examples of that I hear this more, like, not every day, but often enough that it's alarming. We use Macs, so we don't need antivirus. That was a thing people used to say in the 90s and was somewhat true just because not many people use Macs, and therefore the volume of the viruses that were being built were primarily for PCs. People use Macs now, a lot of them. So when you say something like that, it's like, oh no, these people don't have a clue what security is. And if we've discovered this, if they offered up that really naive or judgment position, then if we start flipping rocks here, we know we're going to find a lot more. Another one is, well, we're on AWS, so we don't have to worry about the security of our application because it's outsourced to AWS. And yes, AWS has compliance programs, security, all kinds of stuff, and there's websites and reviews and documents on that. But that doesn't prevent somebody from hacking your application if you're not using the tools properly, or if, for example, you're not practicing proper input validations in your software, and somebody's able to bypass your code base and conduct some sort of SQL injection, for example. Like, Amazon can't protect you out of the box from those types of things. So that's another one. Another one that I hear people say, and this is a kind of an arrogant one. I don't hear it as much, but I do hear it, and it kind of cringe when I hear it. People go like, "Oh, we're just a small startup. Like, we don't have the time and money for this type of enterprise security stuff." Generally when you say that, what it does tell them is, "Oh, wait a minute, there's more risks here than we thought. These guys are actually more likely to run out of money in the next 6 to 12 months." So, that's a really bad answer, that an example of it. So that's one, like, going in there. The other one is trying to kind of BS your way through it. I see companies try to like just skate around the security questionnaire and exaggerate, which kind of becomes lying in the end. That's a really tough one as well. And it's also one I've been talking to a lot of auditors in the enterprise world lately, that they're aware that these companies do that because they know these companies they need to close the deal. They need to get to that next revenue milestone to either make payroll or to close their next funding round. So they're motivated to answer favorably to the questionnaire. And because of that, more sophisticated auditors are generally now going back and scheduling a call to go over some of the questions you've answered in your security questionnaire. It's usually the ones where they're the most concerned and they want to dive in, and they're challenging you. They're trying to find out, are you really doing that thing? And it's really easy to find out in a conversation if it's something you're actually doing it, because you'll be able to talk about it more intimately.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring a lot of that up, and I think the point there is that it's not necessarily the tools that'll protect you, but it's also best practices, and having that culture around it. And I think that's really interesting. It's almost like, to what Andrew was saying earlier, there should be more of a symbiotic relationship between security and development, and I think both of you guys have talked about that. So I think it comes down to me, what I see is whether there's GDPR, CCPA, or whatever's the next thing, that if the culture and the mindset is not there, you always run into something. But it's not anything you should be afraid of. It's something that you can tackle soon, you can tackle now, and you don't necessarily need to throw millions of dollars at it. It's part of the growth of the company, as just like any product evolves, security will kind of be treated the same. And so I'm curious too, also, what do you see upcoming in 2021 that is of interest to you, that you might find that's something we should be aware of? What's on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, you guys sort of touched on a little earlier in this conversation, is that there's a lot of additional legislature coming out all over the world. Every state in the US, or most states in the US, have something cooking, whether it's a cybersecurity law or a privacy law. There's federal laws that are coming up in various countries around the world. So, it's not going anywhere. I do feel, though, that there is more alignment happening as the space evolves. So I think that's good news, because I think it means that it'll be more feasible to have a multi-compliant program built as there's more alignment across a variety of different regulations. Like, Canada's coming out with some changes to their privacy regulation, which align it much more with GDPR. So if you were to implement Canada's privacy law, you would be implementing, for the most part, compliance with GDPR by just inherently doing that other practice. So that's a really good thing. The trend towards risk-based approaches is definitely something that's going to continue. That's a more intelligent and evolved way of doing things. So definitely see that happening. The other interesting trend, and we've actually seen, I mean, we sell to small to medium-sized businesses. And so the thing about compliance is, one of the elements of compliance is vendor compliance. So you're being forced by your enterprise customer, for example, to deploy a compliance program or security posture within your organization. Part of that process is for you to look at your vendors and make sure that your vendors are all compliant. So what that means for companies like us, for example, like Securicy, that are selling to small and medium sized companies, is we're getting security questionnaires from companies that have 50, 60, 80, 100 employees. So that is going to be the trend in 2021, as more and more small to medium sized companies take security and compliance seriously. They're going to be pushing that compliance along to their vendors. So and we're seeing it. I spoke recently with a consulting company that has 6 employees or 5 employees. They need to build a fairly robust security program because of that exact fact. So these are all things that are coming down the pipeline in 2021 for sure.
Yeah, Darren, I really appreciate that. I think the conversation's fascinating, and the takeaway is that it's within reach. A lot of these compliance standards aren't as crazy or scary as they seem, and that we can get started, and companies like yourself are there to help customers out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the thing I would add to that is, I find myself a lot of times, especially with CTOs and technical employees, that generally come in a bit with their hair on fire, seeing this as a frustration. Normally, what I see over the period of a couple of weeks or months is they go from being confused and overwhelmed and frustrated with security to liking security. And really, like any good CTO or good technology person, a lot of security stuff makes a hell of a lot of sense when it's explained to you in the right way and you start seeing it in the context of what you're doing. It becomes logical. So seeing that transition of developers, and that's why I say, like, get your developers learning about OWASP, having your lunch and learns about security. That has such a massive effect, more so than you think it would. But just that knowledge and awareness, they start thinking about that, and it evolves the way they build things. And as we know, like, good software developers are learning all the time. The world of software is not like you go to school, learn a bunch of stuff, and then go write it, and it's going to be you're going to be operating in the same environments in 10 years. These are already people that are used to learning about technology and are always improving their skill set. So this just becomes another opportunity for them to be better at what they do. And when you have a culture and you have a dev team that looks at it through that lens, that is an absolute change in how your company's security posture will evolve.
Perfect. That's a great place to end right there. So I think that's really good, packed full of information. Thank you, Darren.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. You can always connect with us at skiplist.com.